to economic and social cohesion, growing cultural diversity, increasing complexity, a widening political agenda, the climate crisis, and last but not least, the imperiled legitimacy and trust. But as Václav Havel said, without commonly entrenched moral values and obligations, neither the law, nor the democratic government, nor even the market economy will function properly. And the French sociologist and philosopher Edgar Morin recently spoke of planetary crisis and the need to change civilization to address the complexity of today's world. And if we look into European Union, we also can come to the conclusion that the symptoms of broad and systematic crisis are over here with us nowadays. But Europe's capacity to respond to all these challenges depends on its ability to adopt an open-ended vision and a forward-looking narrative, and to consolidate the role of European unions on a global scale. I think that it has to make, first of all, the changes within its style of governance and building the fair society. And this all depends also on us and on our involvement to this process through the dialogue and through the consultations, and also through the development of our networking and European studies. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you very much that you accepted our invitation to participate in this conference and be ready to talk openly about all the issues which you think that are important from the point of view of freedoms, values, aims of European unions. And I wish all of you the success in achieving the scope of the conference as well as its objectives. And thank you very much for coming to us. Thank you very much for being with us. And thank you very much for your attention. And now I would like to give the floor to the representative of the Adenauer Foundation. Please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much once again.
Dziękuję bardzo. Thank you very much. Dear Professor Kozłowski, dear Professor Latoszek, dear students and participants of today's conference, Connecting the European Union of Shared Aims, Freedoms, Values and Responsibilities. My name is Thomas Behrens, and I'm project coordinator at Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Poland. And it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you all to this debate, which was co-organized by our foundation. I'm very glad that we are involved in organizing this important event. Unfortunately, Dr. Angelika Klein, the director of our Warsaw office, was not able to come today and can't join us today due to obligations in Opole and Święcim. But Dr. Klein asked me to be here on her behalf and as well as on behalf of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and to give greetings to all of you. Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is a German institution which provides political counseling. We stand for Christian democratic values. We are operating in Poland since the political change in 1989. And for the very beginning on, we supported the Polish integration into the European community and later on into the European Union. So various topics of today's conference are very interesting and important, and they are in line of the priorities of our foundation. Our activities are focusing on strengthening the European integration and analyzing complex developments taking place within Europe. And these days, we are facing a lot of difficulties and challenges. For example, the migration crisis and national integration policies, the rising power of populism, the Brexit process and its impact on EU policies and institutions, the harmonization of European law, as well as the development of digital economy and digital society. So all these aspects and many more will be discussed today, and concerning such crucial topics, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung tries to provide a free exchange of views by opening the floor to different opinions. Therefore, I'd like to thank the prominent group of experts being involved into this debate today. And last but not least, I would like to express my gratitude to the co-organizers of this conference, the Polish European Community Studies Association, for the initiative and the ongoing and successful organization of this event, and the Warsaw School of Economics for hosting us within this wonderful building. And very personal, on behalf of the team of the Warsaw office of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I would like to thank Marta Pachocka for the excellent cooperation and substantial support. I wish all of you fruitful debates. Thank you for your attention. Dziękuję za uwagę.
Professor Kozłowski, Professor Latoszek, dear Thomas, thank you for these introductory remarks. Now I'd like to move slightly to keynote speeches session, but before inviting our honorable guests, I would like to remind you not to forget to fill in the survey that will allow us to assess your level of satisfaction. I hope it will be quite high, but still we do count on your feedback. Okay, let me now thank you very much for these introductory remarks. Okay. Let me now invite our honorable guests, Professor Adriana Ciancio, University of Catania, and Professor Rinus Pennings, Institute for Migration and Ethnic Studies, University of Amsterdam. Professors, the floor is yours.
First thing, yeah, if it is possible, because I need to read. Okay, now on the floor. Yes. Okay, good morning to everyone. It is a very big pleasure for me to be here today. So first of all, let me thank all the organizers of this conference for the kind invitation and the honor they give to me with this keynote speech at this important conference. But I will try to take only 20 minutes, so I don't want to waste any more precious time. And I can start my presentation, my speech, trying to underline why it is already possible to talk today about a European constitutional law, as the title of my speech suggests, despite the fact that the European Union, as everybody well knows, still lacks a formal constitution. By the way, it is well known that first attempt in this direction proved unfruitful, with the failed entry into force of the so-called treaty adopting a constitution for Europe following the referenda in the Netherlands and in France in 2005. But, however, it is not difficult to overcome this argument against my assumption, since talking about a constitutional law does not necessarily coincide with setting down a constitution as a unique formal document, including those norms that establish a society's fundamental organization. Rather, looking beyond and considering from a substantial point of view what we should assume as a constitutional law, a set of rules suitable to give identity to the members of a political community, since the set of rules express what they stand for, the values they want to affirm and that are distinctive for them. It is possible to conclude that despite the fact that the Treaty of Lisbon is formally another international treaty signed as an intergovernmental agreement, after its entry into force, the EU is finally provided with norms that one might say, ontologically constitutional. It is constitutional in nature. In this light, it is needed to consider first and foremost Article 2 and the values this article sets down as shared values among all member states that constitute the common constitutional platform in order to serve the judiciary both as hermeneutic criteria and legitimacy parameters of all other European and national norms. Moreover, the EU common values represent at the same time a warning and an evaluation criterion for further request of accession to the EU. By the way, it is also worth remembering that these values are protected with adequate guarantees, including political ones, as we need to consider the procedures set in Article 7 in order to manage the clear risk of a serious breach by a member state of the values referred in Article 2. But furthermore, the assumption resumed in the title faces the argument sprouting from Article 16 of the famous 1789 Declaration of Human and Civic Rights that clearly affirms that any society in which no provision is made for guaranteeing rights or for the separation of powers has no constitution. And we know that even though a Charter of Fundamental Rights has been established, the EU's functioning does not yet rely on a clear separation between the legislative power and the executive one, as it is easily verifiable looking at the Council's functions. Rather, the EU inspires itself to a principle of collaboration, we might say, among functions, instead of the more traditional principle of separation. Nevertheless, it would be difficult to deny that the functioning of the European Union is, however, based on a form of function distinctions, as the one set between decision-making powers on the one hand, as those exercised by the European Council, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council itself, and powers of control, as those entrusted to the Court of Justice and the European Court of Auditors. Nor is it possible to deny that this distinction of functions is set to limit the EU powers in order to guarantee the aforementioned EU shared values and principles at large, as well as the fundamental rights and freedoms as ruled by the European Court of Justice in its most recent case law. Therefore, also from this perspective, we should conclude that after the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, the European Union, despite the persistent lack of a formal constitution, is already provided with a true constitutional law that includes both Article 2 and the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which has been given the same efficacy of the treaty itself, jointly representing what could be described as the EU constitutional core, protected through the EU institutional setup, by and large entrusted to guarantee these values and rights. Well, actually, this statement is hard to accept for those who consider the idea of constitution, I mean of any constitution, strictly depending on the notion of a state, since the EU is not a state yet, not even of federal scope. But looking at the Lisbon provisions as a whole, even with the absence of any federalist reference, the EU appears now shaped as a truly, even if still in an embryonic state, political union, sufficiently defined in its legal and institutional profile. It is provided with common institutions and related attributions, with a defined balance of powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, even if, according to a scheme of collaboration complementarity towards a reciprocal equilibrium rather than a separation, as just said. Competences are assigned according to the attribution and subsidiarity principles. An original system of sources of law is set, furthermore destined to prevail over national ones. A Charter of Fundamental Freedoms is defined, and European judges recently have shown to apply them even over traditional economic freedoms. Moreover, European case law ensures uniformity in the interpretation of the law through preliminary ruling, essential for the very process of at least judicial integration. Even more upstream, there is a common value heritage expressed in the above-mentioned Article 2 as guaranteed by the European Court of Justice against infringements both by member states and, even more important, by the European institutions themselves. Nevertheless, considering the European integration project, one cannot but consider that, in contrast with a sufficiently defined, even sophisticated legal institutional system already defining the EU as a, however embryonic political union, it is possible to perceive among the European peoples a persistent lack of consent towards the project of an ever closer union. And in order to discover the main obstacle facing the full implementation of a true political union, it is easy to find out that this issue consists in the absence of the needed presupposition of each political community that, from a sociological point of view, is to be found in the so-called idem sentire, that's the same feeling, in this case about Europe, its future and aims. The statement is easily verifiable. Just looking at the genuine hostility that a big part of the EU citizens shows towards the European integration process, claiming more and more urgently restorations of sovereignty as the outcomes of both domestic and European elections have revealed in several member states through growing of nationalism, populism, and even xenophobia, also at the cost of exiting from the Union, as chosen by the majority of the British voters in the well-known Brexit referendum. The main causes of such detachment between a large part of the European society and the Union, institutions and policies, are easily summed up. An evident inability to effectively manage epochal challenges, both domestic and international, such as the economic financial crisis and migration. The still lingering issue of democratic legitimacy of the EU decision-making process in the new and different shapes it has taken after the signature of Lisbon. And further upstream, the persistent lack of a genuine system of European political parties able to foster the political synthesis at supranational level and to contribute to forming European political awareness as hoped for by the treaties which since Maastricht have identified the European parties as the privileged channels to express the political willingness of Union citizens. These are among the most evident reasons preventing European citizens from feeling a deep sense of common political belonging to the EU. Conversely, only fostering an idem sentire, which represents the necessary condition for the establishment of any political community, it could be possible to cope with the widespread disaffection of European citizens towards the prospect of a truly political union. Therefore, also considering the lack of a common language, as well as the growing ethnical and religious pluralism, it is necessary to find other features of cultural and political identification in order to consolidate among European citizens a sense of collective identity apt to root each national identity in the wider supranational context, strengthening the perception of belonging to the European common home. In other words, we might say, as Jürgen Habermas says, that it's urgent to foster what he calls a sense of civic solidarity among strangers. Thus, from this point of view, it becomes easy to grasp the basic mission of the above described European constitutional law. As heritage of common principles, it is destined to constitute the fundamental catalyst element of a true European people, identifiable other than just the sum of all EU citizens as a real political community brought together and unified thanks to shared values. Without this perception, it would be unlikely and in any case futile to relaunch the constitutional process to sign a true formal constitution, long argued for to abandon the intergovernmental method in order to overcome all the limits that the Lisbon Compromise has revealed, particularly considering the spread of the economic and social crisis, and more recently because of the big external challenges of immigration and international terrorism. Well, these shared values and rights have well-known origins. They represent the transposition as EU primary law of the so-called member states' common constitutional traditions initially identified thanks to the European Court of Justice case law, and later set down in the aforementioned Article 2, a new Charter of Fundamental Rights. Indeed, this European constitutional heritage acts as a sort of constitutional lower common denominator among countries with different legal cultures, common law versus civil law, and with various political and institutional histories and experiences, sometimes even in opposition. Just think to far-right totalitarianism on the one hand and communism on the other hand. Therefore, all member states are expected to comply with the same fundamental values, including, as declared in Article 2, the protection of human rights, freedom, equality, democracy, and more in general, the rule of law in a society based on pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and gender equality, even though with different meanings, interpretation, and applications, depending on each country's institutional history and legal tradition. Conversely, if these values and the rule of law above all are not fully respected in some member states, the EU institutions are tasked to recourse to all the remedies provided in the treaty for their safeguard, as recently recalled by the President of the new European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, in her speech delivered in the European Parliament plenary session on November the 27th. In fact, as already mentioned, these values and rights must be protected by the supranational institutions via both judicial and political means. Thereby, the so-called European constitutional law appears to be committed with another fundamental task: ensure the protection to democracy and its corollaries of rule of law, pluralism, and human rights, even within each member state's legal system. Looking more in depth at the topic from the domestic perspective, it is possible to conclude that member states can no longer forego the EU constitutional law. Indeed, considering the European political integration process on the one hand, and the national constitution's implementation path on the other hand, it is clear that the two phenomena are inextricably linked. This statement is easily evincible for those countries whose current constitutions have been established after the EU's birth, like all the Eastern member states that gained independence with the Soviet Union's end. In this case, it is evident that the national fundamental rules application has always gone in parallel with the EU's development, so that the former has naturally, we might say, been strongly influenced by the latter. But the same is true even in those countries as Italy or Germany, whose basic laws entered into force well before the Treaty of Rome, considering all the relevant transformations the national institutions have gone through as a result of the European integration process, sometimes even without formal revision of the respective constitutions. This state of affairs cannot surprise, since it seems the natural result of the growth of EU public law as a set of rules sprouting from the national legal systems, which, after being harmonized at the supranational level, are later suitable to further influence the domestic setups from which they stem, bringing them closer and closer as the consequence of a sort of circular motion. Indeed, this is the main goal of the integration process itself. Thus, the final outcome is a deep interpretation between European constitutional law and national one that make extremely difficult or even almost impossible to conceive the national institutions' organization and functioning autonomously from the process of European integration and, we might say, able to live out of the EU, as the so far uncompleted Brexit strongly proves. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Ciancio, thank you very much for drawing our attention to the legal aspects of the EU integration, in my opinion, having fundamental value in the highly legalistic structure of the European Union. So thank you once again. Now we'll change perspective, at least a bit. Professor Rinus, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just as an introduction, this conference is on shared values in the EU on integration. Now, I'm working on this topic of international migration, and you immediately feel that there is a discussion on these shared values. On the one hand, the European Union had a huge success in creating an area of 28 countries in Europe, having 500 million people, giving the opportunity to cross borders within that area, look for work elsewhere, create a common market and a common labor market. That's a huge success. It's unheard of in this world. On the other hand, we saw a few years ago in the so-called asylum crisis that same EU was not able, not at all able, to manage the external dimension of the migration, international migration. So this field of migration is one with the highest success on the one hand and the deepest failure on the other hand. And the question is, how come? Why? What's the matter with this particularly? Now, my story is a little bit on trying to find out what is the matter in this particular area, and what is shared and what is not shared, etc. So let me...
Would you like me to change?
Yeah, I'll give you a sign. So I made a PowerPoint, and I'm going to rush through the PowerPoint because I try to make my story explicit. Now, first of all, what I'm going to do is to say some basic things on mobility. That's what the European term is for migration within the European Union. And international migration, that's the European term for migrants that come from outside the European Union. Then I'm going to give you a little bit of an idea what historically has taken place in Europe in terms of migration. Because people do forget and do have a false picture of what has taken place in Europe, because it did not always have the terminology of migration. And then I'm going to the point of how is this international migration and if the following integration of migrants, how is it regulated in Europe? So national immigration regimes and at the European level, and then I come to a conclusion. So shall we go quickly to now, the basics. Very roughly, international migration is changing place of residence across political borders of states and nations. So in that sense, also migration within the EU is international migration, but the European Union has decided that it's not because it created this freedom, and now it's called mobility. Now, for international migration, states define their territory and their citizens, and they claim sovereignty to decide on admission and on the conditions of stay of non-citizens on their territory. This is a very basic kind of thing, but it's policy that makes the different statuses there. Now, states may also decide on who is allowed to leave. That's the situation in Eastern Europe before 89. So migration policy is not only entrance policy, it may also be exit policy or non-exit policy. And then when you do studies of migration, you know, we often think that motivations of people are the important things that we're talking about. Actually, it's much more the labeling by states of what they allow people to go in. So there may be quite a difference between the motivation of the migrant and the label under which he enters a country. So you may, as an opponent of Franco in the 1960s, you may come to the Netherlands as a guest worker because you were not allowed to do an asylum because Franco was a befriended nation. So here you see immediately that we think in terms of state labels, but that's not always the case. So that's my first conclusion here on the basics. There is a lot to learn about the framing of migration. How do we think? What kind of definitions do we give? What is the... Now, my talk, this is what I call a heuristic model for studying international migration. And it says there is a left side where the sending country, so to speak, are a number of factors that we're not talking about that. There in the middle, you see that if there is a migrant community, there is also a dynamic within that migrant community that leads to continuation of migration or not. At the right side, you see the factors in the receiving, the destination country, and you see in the middle the policies of that country. So my talk will focus on the right side. We'll look at economic definitions of migration at the right side, political definitions, social and cultural definitions of migration, which end up in policies of these countries that relate to entrance and return. Okay, now framing is a very important thing. Now what is framing? Framing is the reconstruction of a problem definition of a policy issue. That's the shortest definition. It means actually that you ask for the underlying assumptions of what the problem is. How desirable is immigration? How is it perceived for the country? Or undesirable? Who has the moral or the legal right to become an immigrant? How is the future of these newcomers envisaged? Are we talking about guest workers, temporary guests? That's quite an important, say, frame idea behind this immigration policy. Or do we talk about permanent members? For example, the ones that came in the decolonization in a number of countries in Europe. Now, if we say we include these newcomers, there again are a number of options how we do this. Do we do this by specific policies for integration, or say we just, well, they're here, they have to behave according to our rules and laws and see what they make of it. And then, very importantly, in terms of cultural diversity, how should we relate to the cultural differences and perceptions of different groups in that receiving society? So these are the key questions in framing international migration policy and integration policies following. Now let's look very quickly to what happened in Europe in the last, in my lifetime, let me say. I'm from just after the First World War. Now, there's a first period, 1915, 1974, which is a period of heavy immigration in the northwestern European countries. And that was particularly what we now call the guest worker system, and it was decolonization. We often forget that, but I'll show it later. And then there's the 74 till the end of the 1980s, the opening up of the east of Europe. And then we have the 1999 to 2004. 2004 is the famous date of 10 Central and Eastern European countries accessing to the European Union, which completely changes the picture of migration movements. And then you have the period after 2004 till now. Now let's go very quickly into these periods and see what actually happens. Now, if we look immediately after the Second World War, actually Europe was resettling all those people who were at the wrong place after the Second World War, and that was a massive movement. So 15 million went from east to west and 5 million from west to east. But interestingly also, immediately after the Second World War, it was not immigration in Europe, it was emigration that revived very quickly. The old immigration, particularly to the New World, to the US, to Canada, Australia, etc. The Netherlands, for example, in the 15 years after the Second World War, 500,000 people left the country. So that was a period of immigration. So Europe started not as an immigration. Next, please. Now, what we see then immediately that the guest worker system, the economic recovery was so successful that in Northwest European countries, at least, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, Benelux, Switzerland, and Sweden, economic recovery was so quick that they needed more hands for the Fordist production systems that existed at that time. And they attracted quite a lot of people from the southern part of Europe in the beginning, around 10 million. And 10 million is a lot in that. And after that was exhausted a little bit, they went to North Africa and Turkey. And then again, there were quite a lot of, some 10 million people coming. Not all of them stayed, but quite a bit of them stayed, actually. You see that Germany, at the end of the guest worker period, had 2.2 million workers. France had nearly 2 million, etc. So this was a significant thing. And importantly in this period was decolonization. That was important for UK, for France, for Portugal, for the Netherlands, and very little for Belgium. Okay. Now, the next period is the one after this guest worker period. And actually, it was a period in which the demand had stagnated, and Northwest European countries built up restrictive immigration policies, which was unsuccessful to a great extent because many of the ones who had come before built up rights to bring their family members, etc. So that's where Germany, the Netherlands got their huge immigrant populations from Turkey and Morocco built up. And closing the borders for labor migration meant that there was a lot of new pressure on the remaining opportunity to come in, and that was asylum. So I gave you here a list of how that built up in the course of time, the number of applications you see at the right side, which built up in the 1980s particularly, and then the first asylum crisis in the 1990s, where 2.5 million in a four-time applications were registered. So you see that the way of organizing your immigration has an effect on the labels that are still left and the pressures on these labels, please. Now, what happened, of course, after the opening up of Eastern Europe, you see, again, quite sizable movements. Most of the Europeans do not often think about them, but let's look. 3.2 million left the Central and Eastern European countries, say, immediately after the opening until the accession to the European Union. Many of them went to the Southern European countries who had become immigration countries from the middle of the 1980s on, and particularly in the 1990s. So there was a huge movement from Central and Eastern Europe to Southern Europe, and there was the irregular movement also to Northwestern European countries. All of this was indeed not regulated in the sense of the formal immigration policies that were in place in Northwest European countries. What was important also in terms of immigration were, for Germany, for example, 3 million Aussiedler. The Germans were the ones who claimed Germans from a past that could come from the east to Western Germany. Sizable movements in that. And important in this period, you see where formerly only Northwest European countries were immigration countries, it were now the Southern European countries that had become immigration countries. And very rapidly, Spain, within a period of 15 years, had the level of the percentage of immigrants as high as the Netherlands, for example, within a very short period, with a lot of migration from Central and Eastern Europe, not only. Okay, next. And then you see that this accession had huge consequences for Europe. Accession of, let's say, in 2004 and in 2007, which brought a huge migration or mobility from the east to both the south and the west. It depended very much on, it was of course the new regulation of free circulation, but it was retarded to a certain extent for certain countries by the transition regulations of 5 years and 2 years afterwards. But in terms of movements, these were quite sizable. It ended up with, let's say, 5.2 million people from the Central and Eastern European countries living and working in other EU countries in 2010, and that will be now around 7 million, I guess. Okay, next. It means also that the mobility shifts. There is a lot more mobility east-west within the European Union than international migration from outside. So the European united European integration in terms of labor markets and free circulation had a consequence for policies relating to third country nationals, the ones coming from outside the EU. More and more restrictive, but also more and more difficult because it depended on all of the member states. Because entering the member state was entering the EU, and that meant that there needed to be common policies in that area. Now we end up, after this story, with a European Union of, let's say, roughly 500 million inhabitants. 10% of them, 50, do not live and work in another country than they are born. So there is a lot of immigration in the EU in general. So my thesis is Europe has become an immigration continent in this particular period. Okay, let me see then for a moment how they reacted to it in terms of how these national governments have defined this. Northwest European regimes have been, let's say, firstly welcoming the guest workers. They had, in the beginning, two important labels for people to get in, and that was the guest worker label, and that was the decolonization label. So the Dutch coming from independent Indonesia were called repatriates, whether they ever had been in the Netherlands or not. This was a legal definition of how to come in. You see that after the guest worker period in Northwest European, they built up a very restrictive kind of immigration policy, including, of course, new visa policies, more control, more restrictions, also the building up of a migration industry, the smuggling, the trafficking, the criminalization, securitization. All this happened, let's say, in the 1980s and 90s, and continued in the 2000s. The whole idea about this thing is that in general, in Northwest European countries, immigration was framed as, if it was unavoidable in terms of decolonization, it was framed as temporary immigration of non-members of a society. And it's only a few countries that started integration policies in an early phase. That was Sweden and the Netherlands in the 1980s. But Germany, for example, only started after 2000 in accepting that Germany was an immigration country. Please, the next one. Interestingly, the southern European countries became immigration countries later in the 1990s. And although they had, in the formal sense, exactly the same regulations accepted to regulate immigration, that's through the acquis, in practice they had very different policies. Most of the people who actually went to Spain and Italy went there without formal regulating their status, and most of the people who have a regular status now have got their status through huge regularization movements in Spain and Italy. So they came in an irregular way, many, by the way, from Central and Eastern European countries in the period between 1989 and 2004. And interestingly, of course, these movements were regularized by the accession and the free circulation after 2004. It's an interesting way of seeing that the movement gets another label and gets another title. But you see that Southern European regime of immigration is completely different from the Northwestern European countries, okay? And then we move to, let's look at Central and Eastern European countries. Then you see there was primarily immigration, and that was sizable. In terms of immigration, it has only been the Czech Republic and recently Poland that are becoming immigration countries. Poland to a significant extent, but also under very interesting labels. It's all temporary labor migration, and mostly from the Ukraine and some other countries. But Poland had the highest number of temporary labor migrants of all OECD countries in 2017. So something is happening in this country, changing factually, not in terms of the framing, as far as I can see. Okay, let's move on. Now, what we see, now, what I've now outlined are regimes of national governments. What happened at the European level is that within the European Economic Community first and the European Community later, there's 6 countries in the beginning and the 12 countries later and the 15 countries in 1993 had decided that they would create a free market for labor within the European Union. And that ended up in a huge area in which international migration regulation that used to be the case for these countries because they were foreigners was abolished, and there was free movement of not only workers, but that was in the beginning, but also of, let's continue because I'm spending too much time. Now let's come to conclusions. The interesting thing is that Europe, it's quite clear, needs workers, needs immigrants. You look at the demography, of Poland, look at the demography of the European Union as a whole. It's quite clear that if you want to keep the economic level that you have now, you cannot do without immigrants, even if you take all measures to export your labor-intensive industries to low-wage countries, etc. That has been done already. The interesting thing is so that demography and labor markets ask for hands. But at the other side, we see that in Europe there is a strong culturalization of migration and integration, a strong, well, on the one hand, nationalism that implies anti-immigrant, which implies stressing the national identity and the foreign identity as a threat to national identity. And these are, say, obstacles for having a feasible and a good immigration policy. That's why the discussion on policies on the European level are so difficult. This is relatively new. This culturalization is, let's say, since the end of the 1990s, the turn of the century. Before, there was also, let's say, in some cases, an anti-immigrant sentiment, but it was much more defined as economic competition. So you don't want immigrants because they pick our jobs, which is a different kind of definition. This is defining these newcomers as a threat to your national identity. Oh, that's quite a different argument, and also a very dangerous argument, which, by the way, on the European level leads to a very difficult kind of thing that you touched upon. You know, if we accept that within Europe we do have different national identities, how then create a framework in which these national identities somehow form a unity for the EU? We have this problem. And you know, we will not come to the solution of the refugee and asylum. Look at the discourse on immigrants in Poland or any of the EU countries. This is in the way of any reasonable kind of immigration. Next one, and that's the last one, I guess. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Professor Pennings, thank you very much for outlining or even explaining the migration paradox in the European Union in such an interesting way. I am pretty sure that the presentations of both of you gave rise to many, many questions. We can address them during the coffee break, as right now we should move to the first session of our conference. So thank you once again. And now I would like to invite Professor Patrycja Matusz to moderate the first session of our today's conference. And in the meantime, I will explain that almost all of the papers presented today will be published either in the PECSA scientific journal or in the post-conference monograph, so I would say stay tuned. And the presentation will be available online at the PECSA website, of course, upon the consent of the authors, but please be aware that the consent is, I would say, implicit, so if you do not agree to make your presentation published and publicly available, please let us know. So, thank you very much for this part of the conference, and let's move on to the first session. Professor Patrycja Matusz, the floor is yours. Okay, so please organize.
Hello, good morning to everyone. I don't know, I would like to invite all my three speakers to the first panel, if I may. Edina Mesaros, Reka Frideri, and Joanna Piskosz. Dobrze, już otwieram. I am well known on my university fighting against all men panel, so today I'm very happy to welcome all women panel for the first time. It's a very gender balanced, biased, a bit, but from time to time it's not worse. Okay, knowing that we have a very limited time and there is a time pressure, as you can see, we just started. So I would like you all to stick to 15 minutes so that we have time for questions. Yeah, so please. I'm going to change your slide. If you don't mind.
Oh, can I also?
Yeah, just.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here. It's my third time in Poland and in Warsaw. So I would like to present to you a very actual case study. It's entitled The Refugee Crisis, the Liberal Populist Challenge and the Future of the EU. And I'm wondering whether illiberal democracy is in the march. As my case study, I've chosen Hungary. Okay, so I would like to introduce you a bit in the topic of my research. Probably the term illiberal democracy is familiar to all of you, so it's not a novel concept in the field of political science or international relations. In a highly intriguing essay published by Farid Zakaria in 1997 to Foreign Policy, he was the one who coined the term illiberal democracy. And back then, more than 2 decades ago, he gave a rather gloomy provision that in the upcoming decades, more and more countries will embrace illiberal ideology. So when it comes to the European Union, somehow this term re-emerged and re-emerged in 2014 when in Romania, in my country, in Băile Tusnad, or in Bálványos, in Hungarian language, at a student camp, the Hungarian Prime Minister, after just hammering a supermajority at the parliamentary elections in 2014, in front of a large audience, he presented his new community organizing tenets, and he said that he wishes for Hungary to embrace a liberal democracy instead of a constitutional liberal one. And actually he gave a few countries like Turkey, Singapore, China, India as role models for future competitive societies. And he says that the future for a successful nation building lies in non-Western democracies, not liberal ones, so not even liberal democracies. And since then we have seen various attempts, as probably all of you are familiar with, to introduce various changes in Hungary. We are speaking about a new election law or modifications brought to the constitution in Hungary. So what are the objectives of my research? First of all, I want to analyze and evaluate, or somehow to understand. So why did the Hungarian leadership have chosen to embrace illiberal democracy? So what was the path leading? Because it's not a change which takes place or which happens from one day to another. So it was a longer path. And as I'm specialized in international relations, European studies, and I'm familiar with ER theories, I've chosen Imauler-Wallerstein's world system theory and also the improved version of Raoul Prebisch's core peripheral model, somehow to implement and somehow to understand that I do not want to, and even you to see that Hungary is not an anomaly, it's not a single or individual case. So it's part of a larger global tendency. So I'm assessing the transition of Hungary towards illiberalism as an outcome of its position within the modern world system, and also that of a constant juggling between liberal and illiberal tendencies. And what does the refugee crisis have to do in my presentation? Well, first of all, in the last part of my presentation, I will use the refugee crisis because it's an exceptional, but it was an unforeseen situation which was practically used and exploited by the Hungarian leadership, and somehow it was a perfect pretext or casus belli to question the policies of Brussels and the competence of Brussels when it comes to the management of migration. And in my case study, I treat the refugee crisis as a very good pretext
which further enhanced domestic policies for the leading government for Fidesz. So what is about my methodology? So you see that I've got dependent variable and independent variable. So after I presented it, my dependent variable definitely would be the embracing of illiberal democratic community organizing tenets, not by Hungary, because not the country, but the leadership embraced it. So what are the factors that somehow influence this, this choice? The relation between the core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And I also consider that when it comes to the modern world system, even if Hungary is part of the European Union, is part of OSCE, or of NATO, it's still part of the semi-periphery if we'll single out the country and do not look at it as part of the European Union. So there's a global tendency of illiberalism. According to Freedom House in 2019, 55% of the states in the global realm, they are not liberal and not democratic. So what will be the third one? Of course, that they will discontent and personal and party ambitions, which play the pivotal part. What will be the first hypothesis that I want to prove? That when it comes to embracing illiberal tenets, Hungary should not be singled out as an anomaly, as patient zero, someone to be quarantined, but instead treating as a part of a larger global tendency. And what about the second hypothesis? That I contend that the recent refugee and migration crisis, it was an unforeseen event, but it was masterfully engineered as an existential threat to the reference object, namely to the Hungarian citizens, and it was deliberately used to consolidate domestic political power. So I structured my presentation in 4 chapters, as normal should be. In the first part, I undertook a literature review and a conceptual delimitation. So I defined the concept that I was working, namely referring to that of illiberal democracy coined by Farid Zakaria. So I defined and I've assessed the works of Zakaria. The second one, even in the article that is going to be published, you will see that I've actually analyzed, so I've undertaken a qualitative discourse analysis. So I took the Balványos oldalból, the Tusnád speech, and I will present a few parts of it to you as well. And the third, it was a theoretical framing of my study. So I took Immanuel Wallerstein's world system theory and tried to implement it in the current situation. And the fourth one is actually a summary of liberal tendencies. So what kind of policies were taken since 2010, but especially since 2014. And one of my main case studies, it will be the refugee crisis. So of course, all of you know that, as far as Zakaria said, not all democracies are liberal. So the conceptual delimitation, I believe that every one of you knows what democracy means. Democracy and liberalism do not go hand in hand. I mean, it was a deliberate coupling in the Western hemisphere. So if you take the two terms separately, democracy is about how you elect governments. It's about free and fair elections. So it's about popular participation. And as you see from historical points of view, many times under the democratic elections, authoritarian regimes were invested. What about constitutional liberalism? Well, it's about not how you are making elections, but it's about the aims and modus operandi, so how that government acts. So whether it cherishes individual freedoms and liberties, a dignity over any type of coercion, and it's constitutional because it puts a lot of emphasis on the rule of law and equal treatment for all under the rule of law. Even Zakaria said that it was a deliberate coupling of liberalism and democracy. The qualitative discourse analysis, I don't know how many of you have read. You can find it on the site of the Hungarian government. 1 minute? No. It's okay. So he starts the speech with the fact that in 2008 took place a major change in the international realm. And he said that in the history of the 20th century, there were three groundbreaking moments: the end of the First World War, the end of the Second World War, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, so practically end of the Cold War. He presented them as groundbreaking moments, milestones in the history of mankind. So they were so big changes that everyone knew that from one day to another, their lives are going to be different. And actually, he says that the 2008 economic crisis is a similar moment, only just people, they did not believe that it was such a dramatic change. He even calls it Western's economic crisis, that it led to profound systemic changes. He called that after it, we witnessed a decay of the liberal world order as a symbol of freedom. The liberal world order instead became a henchman of the large multinational corporations. He also said in 2014 during the speech that the future will be of those countries who will be competitive. So there's a race of successful nation building. And he said that there's a race to find the best formula of state building and community organization that could enable the consolidation of internally competitive nations and communities. And he said that it's the end of the national state, of the liberal state, and of the welfare state. So that's why I put there in the center. He forecasted the beginning of the era of the working state. And he said that practically all those countries that already find the best formula, he cited Singapore, China, India, Russia, and Turkey. And I quote him, they are not Western, not liberal democracies, and perhaps not even democracies. So he blames liberal democracy because it failed the people, because it failed the countries, for example, in sinking it to depth or owing in front of international banking or financial institutions, and it failed to protect community assets necessary for self-sufficiency. Probably all of you have heard about the activities undertaken as a reaction to non-governmental organizations. There's also a backlash against NGOs. He says that he doesn't have a problem with NGOs in general. He's just attacking non-governmental organizations who represent foreign interests and somehow try to interfere in domestic affairs. So this was the discourse from 2014. And what about Wallerstein world system theory? So I tried to illustrate, as Wallerstein made a really good description of how capitalism emerged, but capitalism developed on a global realm, and it led to some regions and some states development, but even in an uneven way. So some countries managed to move to the core. They were the most developed, most industrially developed countries. Countries like Western Europe, Northern Europe, the North America, Canada, Japan, they could be considered in the core. So what is outside is the semi-periphery, and even further away is the periphery. From a historical perspective, Hungary was part of the periphery, and even the entire Eastern Europe. So they were importing or exporting raw materials, cereals to the core, but they were not as developed. So according to many, when in 2004, Hungary or Poland, and in 2007, even my country, Romania and Bulgaria, acceded to the European Union, it was their promotion from the periphery to the core. But many analysts say that actually these countries, they are not part of the core, but they're part of the semi-periphery. So that when Hungary acceded, it was more likely a part of the semi-periphery, and the status has maintained even today. So through the Council of Europe, OECD, NATO, or EU membership, it is associated to the core at its rules, but in reality it still belongs to the semi-periphery. And again, this feeling of always playing the part of the second fiddle, compared to the affluent and rich Western neighbors, members of the core, influences the psyche of Central Eastern and of Eastern European countries. So in case of Hungary as well, it causes a permanent state of irritation, friction, and inferiority. Okay, preconditions for a successful setup: electoral setback of mainstream political parties. In 2010, The Socialist Party suffered a loss in front of Fidesz. Since then, we're speaking about a supermajority. And there are some of the policies that were taken, probably you have heard of many of them. They revised the Constitutional Court, modified the Criminal Code, eliminated an independent fiscal council, they've got a new election laws, so they reduced the number of the parliament to 199. And what about the refugee crisis? I mean, I put it as a saga of national consultations in 2005 because there were plenty of them. National consultation on immigration and terrorism, referendum in order to somehow have a justification why they refused the mandatory relocation quota. It was not a valid referendum because of the low turnout. The Stop Soros bill. So actually he used the referendum in order to introduce more severe laws. They have changed the asylum code, criminalized immigrants, for example, who cut the fence, the technical fence. They have created border hunter units. Now it's possible to involve the Hungarian army in case of extraordinary migratory situations. They have declared a state of emergency in 2 counties with Serbia, which is maintained even today, even though since 2015 September, even today the number of immigrants significantly decreased. It was a national consultation on Soros plan. If you read them, Brussels is being attacked by Hungary, various occasions that they have not managed they did not do well with managing the migration. And the last one, what I want to show you, of course, they have used these billboards and the migration crisis in order to win the elections in 2018, saying that if a new opposition party, they're going to open up the fences and Hungary is going to be invaded by third country nationals. And the last one, it's a national consultation. I could not find it in English. It's about the protection of families. And if you look, it's a questionnaire of 10, formed of 20 questions. And the first one, do you agree that the low birth rates, or actually the decrease in the number of population, should be resolved by immigration or by increased financial assistance given by the government? And you see how many people agreed that we do not need, in Hungary, they do not need immigrants, but they need more enhanced financial help, the Hungarian couples to make more babies. So this was a national consultation started in 2018, and you can see in the Democracy Index, but not just Hungary, so that's why I told you that it's a trend, especially in Eastern Europe. Please look at my country as well, Romania. It's an even worse. So they are considered, according to this index, flawed democracies, such as Czech Republic, Lithuania, Latvia, Slovakia, even your country, Poland. And what about the conclusion? So at the global level, according to Freedom House, when it comes to democracy, it's worse than a few decades ago. If you look at Hungary, it received a 3.0 freedom rating from this think tank. So it moved from full democracy to that of partly free democracy in 2019. So the liberal tendency observed by Zakaria more than 2 decades ago is not waning, and it's not losing from impetus, and it's snapping into an accelerated mode. Okay, thank you.
Hello, good morning. My name is Reka Fidő and I'm from the Center of Excellence of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And my presentation will be about the European Ombudsman and democratization in the EU. So I don't have a slide, so I will speak like that. In the Maastricht Treaty, the Office of the European Ombudsman was established in connection with European citizenship, and European citizenship was needed to introduce because the early period of the European integration gave no role to citizens, and for the deepening of the integration, a sort of identification and means of demonstrating it needed a European added value, and it was required. They also wanted to establish a direct link between the Union and the citizen. When the concept of the EU citizenship was created, it was only a frame. It could only have serious consequences for the involvement of the European public in community policies once it was established with civil, cultural, and social rights. Also, citizenship offered direct connection between the Union and the citizen, and although classical ombudsmen do not have an express mandate for human rights protection and promotion, the violation of human rights by government institutions and bodies as maladministration falls within their mandate. And we can see the European Ombudsman as a true classical ombudsman, and as a true classical ombudsman in international or supranational level, it uses human rights norms that are part of the applicable legal system and applies them in human rights related cases. So the main cause for setting up this European office was the aim of strengthening oversight of the EU institutions and making the EU institutions more democratic by setting up a body to which the citizen can turn. Although in different ways, the definition of good administrative practices or good administrative behavior has been used by the European law since the 1960s, enshrined through the activities of the court. The right to good administrative procedure was embodied in the Code of Good Administrative Behavior, which was written by and set up by the European Ombudsman. And this was formulated in the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union. And we can find Article 41 and 43, 41 and 43 in the Charter, where 41 sets up the right to the good administration, and 43 sets up the right to turn to the European Ombudsman with a complaint. It followed the idea that this new forum would contribute to the achievement of an open, reliable, and service-oriented government. The democratic element of the establishment of the office appeared already in 1998, when the ombudsman conducted an own initiative inquiry where the subject was a correct procedure determining the relation between the public officials of the community bodies, institutions, and the public, and to clarify a good administrative procedure. The Ombudsman initiated this investigation because of complaints made where the offenses could have been avoided with a clear and open public record of obligations of the officials. During the procedure, the Ombudsman stated that the office was set up at international level, supranational level, in connection with the Union's commitment to a democratic, transparent, and accountable administration. When we look at the work of the EU Ombudsman and we look at the institutional life of the EU, we see that most of the complaints are against the EU Commission. The Ombudsman received several complaints against the Commission in its role as a guardian of the treaty. And the Ombudsman deals with both procedural and substantive aspects of the Commission's behavior. In this regard, the Ombudsman uses the communication of the communities that provides an obligation how to register complaints for certain exceptions to these obligations, and also establishes deadlines for dealing with complaints. The Commission originally issued this communication in response to the Ombudsman's inquiries and criticism in relation to these matters. And for example, in 1997, the Ombudsman started own initiative inquiries against the EU Commission's infringement procedure based on Article 258. Because this complaint procedure starts before the infringement procedure, and the Ombudsman deals with these complaints procedure, not exactly the infringement procedure. For example, the Ombudsman found that contrary to a complaints allegation that the Commission failed properly to deal with the infringement complaint, the Commission had several substantive replies. And also, in another case, the Ombudsman pointed out that in handling of infringement complaints, the Commission is not free from constraints flowing from fundamental rights and principles of good administration. Also, the Ombudsman took the view that the complexity of the issues did not justify the delay incurred in this case. And regards the consistency issues raised as an argument by the Commission, the Ombudsman declared that pursuing a consistent approach must not lead to unnecessary delay in the complaint procedure before the infringement procedure. The Ombudsman's inquiries and conclusions fully respect the Commission's discretionary power recognized by the treaties and the case law of the Court of Justice, and whether they decide or not to refer an infringement to the court. When investigating infringement complaints, the Ombudsman may also review the substance of the analysis and conclusions reached by the Commission. However, he may, for example, check whether such analyses and conclusions are reasonable, well-argued, and thoroughly explained to the complaint. The Ombudsman has dealt with the rules and procedures of the Commission as well, which are in place to prevent conflicts of interest regarding current commissioners, as well as activities of former commissioners. There were several complaints, for example, regarding the former Commissioner Barroso's new role or new position in an investment bank, the so-called Goldman Sachs Investment Bank, and the Ombudsman conducted an inquiry about the paid position held by former Commissioner Barroso, and concluded that the Barroso Commission had failed adequately to deal with the former Commissioner's breach of the Code of Conduct, despite concerns having been raised by the ad hoc ethical committee. There were other complaints regarding, thank you very much, there were other complaints regarding Commission, for example, the Juncker Commission was in several complaints because, for example, the so-called Salmeyer official in the Juncker Commission had got a top role in the Commission, and the EU Ombudsman stated that cases like that, or cases like the Barroso, for example, enhance and add add fuel the fire to the populist movements, because they add to the issue that the EU is not democratic enough and not open enough and not accountable enough, because there were several arguments that, for example, the former Commissioner Barroso will lobbying more successfully than others, because he works now in an investment bank, and this investment bank, the Goldman Sachs investment, was, for example, in the scandal of Eurozone crisis. And what is the conclusion of the democratization process and the EU Ombudsman Office? What is the link between the two? When the office was set up, the picture was blurred furthermore, because it was a political game, and at the end, the EU Ombudsman's Office was established. It was a political game between the European Parliament, between several member states, and at the end, the Ombudsman's work and opinion plays an important part in the development of the general principles of the rules of the rules of the administration. And on the basis of the above mentioned, the European Ombudsman seems to play a complex role, and his procedure cannot only be linked to the dispute solving, creating, and protecting fundamental rights. And it was pointed out in the past by the Committee of Petitions that regarding the Ombudsman's role, the protection of the rights and citizens and the improvement of the connection between the European citizens and the European institutions and bodies go hand in hand. So this can strengthen and give a sense of common European identity to the European citizen. Thank you very much.
Okay, so good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to present to you today some reflections on the Commission's proposal for a regulation on the protection of the Union's budget in case of the rule of law deficiencies. Interestingly, according to the Commission who submitted the proposal, a major innovation regarding the next EU long-term budget is not about the budget itself, so for example about the budget's volumes, but it is about the element of the legislative package linking EU funds and the rule of law principle. My presentation is basically founded on an assumption that identifying the proposal's ratio legis is, as a matter of fact, a prerequisite for any further political and legal analysis on the proposed mechanism. The research problem focuses on a primary aim of the proposal, determining if the regulation's goal is to protect the EU financial interests, as indicated by a prima facie intuition, or maybe the proposal was intended to strengthen the rule of law among member states. In order to discuss the issue, I will provide arguments advocating both hypotheses. Due to obvious limitations, I will focus only on selected aspects. So, first argument in favor of the thesis that the rule of law conditionality is, first of all, a tool to protect the EU financial interests, is connected with business. As you can see, the European Commission presented a broader approach to the understanding of the rule of law principle. Rule of law deficiencies increase business risk, which may discourage private entities from cooperating with governments in investments financially supported by the EU. The respect for the rule of law is then considered only as a tool to encourage business initiatives, innovations, and investments financially supported by the EU, concluding then if spending of the EU funds was affected due to rule of law limitations, the EU budget would be simply at stake. Secondly, in accordance to the Article 7 procedure, a treaty-based instrument dedicated to the rule of law backsliding, when a serious and persistent breach of, for example, rule of law is determined, the Council may suspend certain member state rights deriving from the application of the treaties. In particular, suspension of the rights encoded in the treaties, ergo deriving, of course, from the secondary law, may embrace, for example, suspending payments from the structure funds, because, as a matter of fact, receiving EU funds, for example, from the Regional Development Fund, is as states' right under the treaties and under the secondary law. Also, according to the Commission's proposal, in case of generalized deficiencies as regards the rule of law, the Commission may suspend certain member states' rights, for example, suspending of payments from the EU funds. To conclude, as the Article 7 procedure already provides similar sanction to those foreseen by the proposal, it would be, let's say, pointless to repeat similar regulations. So logical in view of this argument, the proposal's goal cannot to be only strengthen the rule of law. And finally, in accordance with the treaties, the Union is obliged to counteract fraud and other illegal activities affecting the EU financial interests. So in 1999, the European Anti-Fraud Office was established. However, Olaf neither has authorization to conduct criminal investigations, nor can investigate corruption, which does not involve EU administration staff. For this reason, the Commission is ultimately dependent on the states, prosecution services, supervisory authorities, and the whole judicial system. Consequently, in case of rule of law deficiencies, the Commission lacks of instruments to protect the financial interest. But according to the Article 3 of the proposal, as you can see, appropriate measures like reduction of funding should be taken when, for example, carrying out controls by the state affects the protection of the EU budget. The argument I've already discussed indicates that the proposal's primary goal is to protect the EU financial interest, especially through ensuring an effective combat of fraud and other illegal activities. So now let me turn to the next hypothesis, stating that the real proposal's aim is to strengthen the rule of law. A long-standing EU policy tool is applied to achieve its objectives is the principle of conditionality, especially spending conditionality. Major EU funding programs have adopted specific objectives as conditionals. That is because conditionality, as opposed to unconditional equalization payments, is a defining feature of the EU policy. The well-known Copenhagen criteria, convergence criteria also count as the principle of conditionality, and arguably the idea of establishing spending conditionality not directly connected to the financing program per se shall not be considered novelty. For example, the Cohesion Fund is equipped with a so-called excessive deficits macroeconomic conditionality since 1994. Concluding then, the principle of conditionality introduced under the proposal is, as a matter of fact, not a revolutionary approach, not at all. Linking EU funds and the rule of law condition is precisely a new type of spending conditionality whose objective is to strengthen the rule of law and at the same time to promote the Union's aims as stated in the treaty. Secondly, it is believed that the existing so-called rule of law toolbox falls short of upholding the European values. Conceivably, it might be a false assumption that the Copenhagen criteria could guarantee every new member state admitted to the Union is a liberal democracy, which would be a sufficient condition to preclude any rule of law limitations in the future. That is why one might imply that actually the Article 7 procedure, how it looks like, was designed on that false assumption. So maybe that is the reason why the Article 7 procedure is not so ineffective. It seems logical when you compare the Article 7 procedure and the procedure of implementing appropriate measures, like, for example, suspending of payments in the proposal. Under the proposal, the decisions are taken only by reverse qualified majority voting. What else? The European Parliament and the European Council do not play a role in the whole process. Moreover, according to the Court of Auditors' opinion, which was obligatory in the legislative procedure, I quote, "The Commission is provided with more discretionary power than in any other instrument intended to counter a breach against values stated in Article 2 TEU." So, given all of the above, one may conclude that the primary of the proposal is to strengthen the rule of law, and the mechanism introduced by the proposal was introduced to overcome the inefficiency of the Article 7 procedure. Moreover, what also indicates such a conclusion is the current, let's say, political climate among several member states who stress the need of solidarity and complying with the European values by the EU funds beneficiaries. That is why the new spending conditionality could be used by the Commission as a bargaining chip in the upcoming MFF negotiations. Okay, and finally, the financial regulation applicable to the general budget, as well as the Common Provisions Regulation on the ECI funds, the European Structural Investment Funds, already provide measures intended to protect the EU financial interests. As you can see, these examples from the financial regulation, the measures foreseen by the financial regulation are analogous, let's say, to that one indicated by the proposal. Also, when it comes to the Common Provisions Regulation, the conditions foreseen by the regulation for the structure funds are very similar to that one from the proposal. Concluding then, the EU law already provides probably sufficient instruments designed to protect the EU financial interests. It may then indicate that the proposal's primary aim is not to protect the EU financial interest, but to strengthen the rule of law among member states. To sum up, although a clear statement in the Article 1 of the proposal putting the protection of the EU budget first has been made, it is not excluded that the literal understanding of the provision may be wrong. As the provided arguments have shown, I hope, it is possible that the primary goal of the proposal is just to promote the respect for the rule of law by the use of EU funds. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to start with the questions. We do have 10 minutes for questions and comments. Yeah, may I ask you for? Thank you. One there above. No.
Now better.
Oh, yes.
So I would like to ask the first presenter, and thank you very much for bringing up the liberal democracy, and Viktor Orban, I think, is a very interesting case. And I want to tell you, because also you referred to Poland, and Mateusz Morawiecki has actually made this reference to the imbalance between the West and the Eastern Europe. But you talked about Immanuel Wallenstein, and you talked that it's somehow Hungary as a semi-periphery. So do you place it as a semi-periphery in Europe or in a way of populist? Because Viktor Orban has been called as a populist. So are you placing him in the semi-periphery of a group of populists or of a group of, for instance, Salvini, the previous Prime Minister of Italy, was also part of, with Viktor Orban, of some kind of supporters of Russian oligarchs? Where are you placing this semi-periphery, if you can? Thank you very much.
Maybe we can collect some questions, because I see another one there, and then you are going to answer, let's say, 3 of them.
Thank you very much. I also have a question to the first speaker. Thank you very much for this presentation. It was very interesting. And I would like to ask if you feel, and it may be your very personal opinion, do you think that the European Union is doing enough in case of Hungary? I mean, the European Union institutions, are they doing enough right now to improve the situation there and to restore the liberal democracy? Thank you.
Thank you.
So I am. Thank you very much for a nice presentation. That's why I'm referring to the first speaker, related to the EU funds. So you are just presenting the legal perspective. So the aim of the EU is to protect the rule of law, but the aim of the European Union is also to protect the economic and social cohesion. So the question is maybe just the voice in the discussion how to promote the economic and social cohesion, and how to strengthen the rule of law. So does it mean that the regions which are the poorest in those countries which don't respect the rule of law don't get the budget, don't get the EU funding for promoting their development? So this is only the question, or just what is your opinion about on the issue? Because this is my economic perspective, this is your legal perspective, and the economic perspective on the chances for the regions which are lagging behind, and which are in those countries which don't respect the rule of law.
Okay, thank you. And the last one, then I would like to give the chance to answer the questions.
Thank you for the presentation. My question would be addressed to the concept of illiberal democracy that we started talking about. It is more and more discussed nowadays, and some people in the discourse say that we have to protect the liberal democracy, what we were standing on basically. Some others say that because we're developing and the European Union is developing, we have to pay attention to other sentiments that are arising. Now, in the age right now where even the right wing and populists are so blurred that we can't even attribute them to social or political sentiments, don't you think that there is maybe, or is it not, a possibility that illiberal democracy can exist without the breaches of
fundamental European principles, and if this model can be perceived, what we can do to make it effective, if it exists, if we can consider it.
Okay, thank you. Can we start with the answers, please? Because there are already a couple of questions. So, can you take the microphone, please? The first presentation was very popular.
To the lady in the back. So thank you for your questions. So where you're asking me that whether I can place Viktor Orban is in a semi-periphery of group of leaders. Well, the core and periphery model is not about that. So perhaps I did not have time to give a correct explanation. So semi-periphery, it means that I'm positioning Hungary from the perspective of the modern economic system. So I refer the countries in the semi-periphery that they're not in the core, so they're not 100% developed countries. I mean, they're not like the German, Japan, or the United States of America. So they are countries practically between the core and the periphery. Periphery countries could be emerging nations or least developed countries or LICUS countries, like low-income countries under stress. So this is, that's why I put that from the perspective of economic development, it's still a country in the semi-periphery, but it's not related to the group of populist leaders. Okay? So this was the first. Can I also?
Yes, please.
The second one. So the second question, the lady asked me whether is my personal opinion that the EU is doing enough in case of Hungary to somehow to curse it to go on the right path. I do not know that if it's doing enough, but at least it's trying. So we've seen various attempts from the EU Commission, and I'm speaking about the infringement proceedings. So the European Commission, together with the Court of Justice, started plenty of infringement proceedings against Hungary. The first one, if I recall it, was related to the early retirement of judges. So when Hungary tried to bring modifications to the Constitutional Court, and it also wanted the early retirement to reduce it from 70 years to 60, so it was a clear discrimination based on age. And the European Commission acted, and in 2013, Hungary had to correct this law. So since 2013, now we do not have from a reduction of ages of early retirement of judges from 17 to 62, but in a decade, it will be decreased to 65. So we have seen serious attempts. All of you have heard about the European People's Party. Orban called it a mutual decision, so it was not expelled. For example, I was awaiting for Hungary's Fidesz to be expelled from the European People's Party, but it was just suspended. So we will see what will happen. There's about a problem of triggering Article 7. My colleague told about Article 7. I don't think that if other countries like Poland or Slovakia will sustain Hungary, as Hungary will sustain Poland in a similar situation, I don't think that. But perhaps what my colleague, Mrs. Peskors, was saying, that probably if you suspend paying the EU fund, probably it could be a first step towards bringing them to the right path. So we shall see from that perspective. Now, when it came to the Commission hearing in the European Parliament, you know that the first representative of Hungary was rejected, and the second one now it was promoted. But all of you have seen probably the hearings in the European Parliament. But this was also in case of Romania, so the Romanian commissioner was rejected as well. Yes, well. The Polish as well. I'm speaking about, but in case of Romania, it was the lady was totally unprepared for the job. So I do not know that it's doing enough, but at least it's doing. But I would really want to see that, whether, not just in case of Hungary, in case of any country that is not honoring the EU law, and it also includes my country, Romania. or in case of Romania, perhaps the suspension from the Socialist Democrat Party of the socialists from Romania, which did not happen. Again, the third question, so somehow you asked me that it should be possible for a coexistence, for sort of peaceful coexistence of a liberal democracy within the existent EU order. When actually, if you read, because I read carefully his speech from 2014, and he said that what kind of illiberal democratic community organizing tenet that he's foreseeing, it's not against, so it's not an attack on liberal values. So it will not repudiate the respect of human rights or of ethnic minorities. And at the end of his discourse, he said that it's not necessarily against EU rules and EU values. So the envisaged working state is not against EU values. For example, still we're speaking about the respect of human rights. I don't know if it could be compatible, but now you see some sort of a coexistence, even if Hungary is being attacked. So I believe that we'll see in the future, but it's definitely a tendency. And if you analyze Farid Zakaria's book, he said that not all democracies has to be liberal, and democracy and liberalism do not go hand in hand. So as I presented in the first slide, they were deliberately coupled. And if you look at this liberal interventionist, so from another theory of liberal interventionism, and to provide and somehow to spread the liberal model in various parts of the world, like the Maghreb, through the Arab Spring, or in the Middle East, it's not working. So this liberal Western type of democratic model in some countries is ill-suited. I don't think that in case of Hungary is ill-suited, because it's a different. We'll see whether it will be possible peaceful coexistence. Thank you.
Okay.
So thank you for your question, because you already raised a crucial issue about the proposal, how to combine the two basic aims of the union, right? The rule of law and the economic cohesion. The proposal already has a provision that when the measures are taken, for example, suspending of payments, there is still the obligation to make payments to the final beneficiaries, to the recipients of or beneficiaries, for example, Erasmus students, right? And we are the legislative procedure is still ongoing. We are awaiting the first reading in the Council, but after the first reading in the European Parliament proposed a lot of amendments, and one of the crucial amendment was about the situation of the final beneficiaries. For example, they proposed that there should be a special system designed that the final beneficiaries could through online submit to information to the Commission that they do not receive their funds. And it is, in my opinion, it could be not fair to the EU EU fund beneficiaries countries, like, for example, Poland, because when the measures are taken against such countries, it would be much more harmful for them than to countries which are not so based on EU economies, not so based on EU funds, like for example Poland.
Okay, because I was asked to be very strict with time, I would like to thank you for the presentations. Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. And I think it's a short break for coffee, and then we go further with the next session. Okay, 20-minute coffee breaks. If you have more questions to our presenters, please feel free to ask them, and thank you very much.
That all the upcoming sessions are held in parallel, either in Auditorium 1, where we are right now, or in Auditorium 2, that is across the hall. So in parallel will be held the sessions. Thank you.